So I'm talking today about multi-species swards and their performance, and I guess our work in this area started back in about 2012, and our interest in it is really around enhancing the ecological processes, that the natural ecological processes that will allow us to, I suppose, reduce our reliance on nutrient inputs. So in terms of where we know we have to get to, if we look at the farm to fork strategy, we know that there's a requirement that we reduce our reliance on fertilizers by 20% by 2030. But we also have other commitments under the Water Framework Directive and the recent EPA report, for example, which show that we still have a very significant body of work in order to get all our watercourses to good ecological status before 2027. In terms of multi-species grasslands, I guess what I'm referring to here are grasslands that may help be part of the toolbox of trying to address these challenges that will lie ahead of us and that we're currently trying to grasp with. We're talking about swards here that have a relatively low number of species within them, a handful, somewhere between 6 and 12 species, for example, that have been carefully chosen for their potential productivity. And I guess the premise is that when you grow these together, that they'll be able to utilize resources in a more effective and efficient way than perhaps just growing a monoculture. And of course, that happening above ground, but also recognizing that it will happen below ground as well in response to different rooting strategies and depths, etc., of the different species that are included within those swards. So I suppose our first project in this area was Smartcross, a project that was funded by the Department of Agriculture. And this was our starting point. We wanted to identify whether there was potential there in terms of multi-species swards grown under reduced N inputs in terms of providing a potentially viable alternative to high input ryegrass monocultures. We certainly weren't expecting necessarily that any of the multi-species swards would perform or outperform the ryegrass, but it was just to see if we could find a viable alternative. And to do that, we established a plot experiment back in 2013, where we had 112 plots consisting of 1 to 9 species, and those were taken from 3 functional groups, plant functional groups, so including grasses, legumes, and forage herbs within them. And we included those different species from the different functional groups in different proportions in the different mixtures. And we tested those across different nitrogen input levels, so ranging from 0 to 135 kgN per hectare per year, and we had a conventional control of perennial ryegrass receiving 250 kgN. So we harvested those 8 times over the growing season and monitored everything, I suppose, that we could in terms of the plant growth over that time period, but took samples for dry matter production, but also to look at the composition of that dry matter production as well. So in terms of the results from that work, this graph here shows that the dot, it's along our x-axis, that we have an increasing nitrogen rate. So we're working from 0 to 135 kgN, and we're looking at the response of different sward types in response to that increase in N. And on the y-axis, you can see the kilograms dry matter per hectare produced from those different sward types. The different colors of the lines are representing the different mixtures we included in this experiment. So they're always presented in terms of the proportion of grasses, legumes, and herbs included in the initial mixture that was sown. So for example, you have one there, the green one is 100% grass with no legumes or herbs in it, while the orange one is 55% grass, 35% legume, and 10% herb. So you can see the dotted black line there, and that's the yield from the perennial ryegrass receiving 250 kgN. And you can see from this that many of our multi-species mixes actually performed really well by comparison, even receiving 0 nitrogen input. But when we move to 45 kg, and we start to see some of them outperforming the perennial ryegrass receiving the high N input. Now that line at the top represents a mix that included 60% legume, and that blue line, so hence the performance there. If we look at this throughout the different parts of the growing season, so from spring, the herbage production, we can see again that many of the multi-species mixes are performing really well, even at 0 N input. In summer, the ryegrass really came into its own. However, we still did have that 55-35-10 mix that was out yielding it. And over the autumn, we see again that while the ryegrass, the growth, the herbage production dropped back, a number of our mixtures were performing really well into the autumn. Just in terms of the composition of that yield, we divided up our samples into the different component species. So if we look at composition in response to nitrogen input levels, that top line there is a sward that was sown with 60% legume and the remainder was grass. And in response to that, we see that at 0 N, we get 28% of our dry matter is coming from grass and 70% from legumes. While at 135 kgN, we're getting 45% of our yield from grass and 52% from legumes. Now, there's no yield change though, there's no difference in how much is being produced. So really all we're doing by adding in that nitrogen is just changing the composition of the dry matter, but we're not actually increasing the yield. And similarly, we find that to a greater or lesser extent with some of the other mixtures. We were promoting the grass component by increasing the nitrogen input, and reducing the legume content. And in some cases we get a yield response, yes, but I guess it's up to individual farmers whether they need that yield response. And I guess what this does is maybe provide people with options so they can decide what they're going to put in. In terms of weeds, and I know it's always a concern because you can't use a post-emergence spray on these swards. What I can report from our work, and this is at one site, so that has to be taken into account, but we had very low weed occurrence within our swards here. The biggest issue we had was legumes jumping into our monocultures, and that's represented by the green line that you're seeing on that graph there, although that was decreasing in response to nitrogen input. I guess another concern people have is around the persistence of these species, or questions that we often get is around the persistence of the species. And really that's going to change depending on the species you're talking about, but also whether it's cut or whether it's grazed. And this is work that we were showing from cocksfoot under simulated grazing conditions or cutting conditions versus grazing conditions. And you can see a decrease in yield under, or decrease in persistence under grazing. Similarly with Timothy, and we're also showing the ribworth plantain, how that's performing versus chicory. I guess while we look at those and say, okay, they're decreasing in persistence or abundance over time, and that's true, we have to remember that we were managing these swards as ryegrass swards. So we were cutting them or grazing them on the same sort of rotation as you would a ryegrass sward, but also to the same sort of post-grazing sward height. And I think what we've learned from this is that ryegrass management does not suit these kind of mixes. We need to adapt our management to be able, for these species to be able to persist. In addition, we did some work on these plots on earthworms, and I just want to provide you with a very quick overview of the impacts on earthworm biomass and abundance. And we can see here that certainly the legume inclusion in swards is really driving a very significant growth in both legume biomass and also abundance. And talking to my colleague Professor Olaf Schmidt, he would say this is a kind of recognized relationship, but really important that we acknowledge it, that legumes within swards are going to enhance that earthworm component of the sward. Other additional work on a subset of plots that we undertook was to look at surface casts, earthworm surface casts, as an indicator of earthworm activity within the swards. And again, we can see here that it was lowest under our ryegrass sward. So all of the sward types that had legumes within them had a greater level of earthworm activity as indicated by the earthworm casts. And also measuring water infiltration rates, we found a similar relationship. And when you look at the two together, we find that that relationship is very significant and very positive. So that led us on to the establishment of the UCD Lions long-term grazing platform. And I guess that has come about certainly down to the vision and the foresight of our head of school, Professor Alex Evans, to lead to the establishment of this platform that will allow us to look at a whole range of components of sustainability of ruminant production systems over time. And the initial project that we have running on that is Smart Sward, which is our follow-on project from Smartcross. And again, that's funded by the Department of Agriculture. What we have within the platform is 3 experimental farmlets established in 2019, and each of those is 8 hectares in size. So we have a perennial ryegrass monoculture, and that's receiving just over 200 kg per hectare per year, ryegrass and white clover, and a multi-species mix then, so a 6-species mix, and that and the ryegrass and white clover are receiving 90 kg. It's stocked at a stocking rate of 2.5 livestock units per hectare. And Tommy will be talking to you about animal performance results from that in a few moments. But just to look very quickly at the sward performance, and we're always careful about, data from just 1 year, but this is the yield in kilograms of dry matter per hectare from the 3 sward types over 2020. And I guess you can see from this that there's not much of a difference in terms of yield from that last year. However, that yield on the ryegrass and white clover multi-species mixes, it has to be remembered, is coming from swards that are receiving less than half the amount of nitrogen that the ryegrass swards are receiving. Another project that we're involved in and working with our colleagues in Devonish and Wageningen on is Heartland. And here we have 4 sward types where we're looking at ryegrass, permanent pasture, a 6-species mix, and also a 12-species mix. And in that instance, the swards are being co-grazed by cattle and sheep. And just to give an insight, again, that was established in 2019. And this, it allows us to see how these swards perform under real grazing conditions. And just to show the yields from those sward types during 2020, again, with the proviso that this is only 1 year's data, but we can see how our 6 and our 12 species mixes are performing really well under much reduced nitrogen input conditions. The last slide I want to show here is one that just highlights the change in growth rates from the different sward types at Dowth. And what I have highlighted here in the grey box represents the time period during the drought last year. I think it's really interesting to see how the different swards performed during that period. So the green line represents our 6-species mix, while the 12 species mix is represented by the yellow line. And yes, you see a decrease in yield or growth rates rather over that time period of the drought, but it's not as much of a decrease as we're seeing in either the ryegrass or the permanent pasture. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Tommy Boland, and he'll talk about the animal performance end of things.
Thanks very much, Helen. So just while you're getting set up there, Tommy, just want to say a special welcome to our viewers in Germany and the UK and across Europe. And I see we have some viewers dialing in from the US as well. So you're all very, very welcome. So Tommy, we'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Mark. And I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate yourself and Pat and the team in Teagasc on the 1-year anniversary of the Signpost series. It's extra pressure on me now to mark the 1-year anniversary, I suppose. But before I kick off, I'd also like to congratulate acknowledge my collaborators on this work, and as Helen has already done, acknowledge the funders, which are many at this stage. So my focus is going to be on the impact of multi-species swards on animal performance. But just a few things to kind of set the scene from my perspective. Multi-species sward is a broad term used to describe swards containing a range of different plant species. And we're currently using it as kind of a catch-all, but there are a lot of different types of multi-species swards available on the market. They're also referred to as herbal leys. They're not to be confused with species-rich grasslands, as multi-species swards are sown, renovated swards, whereas the species-rich grasslands are more traditional swards which have developed over decades. You might be familiar with them as legume herb swards in New Zealand, but they're not exactly the same as the multi-species swards we have in Ireland. And multi-species swards, they're dynamic between and within years. So I'm just showing you a series of different pictures of multi-species swards, and visually they look quite different, even though they contain the same, in some instances, the same species, just at different ratios. And these final two pictures are of a multi-species sward we established in lines last August. So this was the picture of that sward in September, where it pretty much looks to be dominated by chicory. And this is the same sward yesterday when ewes and lambs are turned out to graze that, and it's dominated by grass and by plantain. So it's important to understand that we're talking about a fairly dynamic sward, much more dynamic than a perennial ryegrass pasture or even a perennial ryegrass white clover pasture. My presentation is going to focus on Irish data because I do feel it's very important to test these scenarios in an Irish context. And I will focus on animal performance to date, growth and yield data from our animal studies. We are looking at environmental impacts such as nitrogen excretion and methane emissions. And in some cases, work is planned, and other cases that work is ongoing. And I also would like to acknowledge the significant workload that's undertaken in Teagasc at the moment on beef, sheep and dairy systems. And the results of that work are really, I suppose, looked forward to on my behalf. So just to build on what Helen has said, if I go back and look at the animal grazing part of the Smartcross project, we had a sheep study in that particular project, and we tested 4 different swards under sheep grazing. We had a perennial ryegrass sward receiving a relatively high level of fertilizer nitrogen. And for the rest of my presentation, the ryegrass sward will be indicated by the red bars. We had a ryegrass and white clover sward, blue, a 6-species sward containing 2 grasses, 2 legumes, and 2 herbs, which be indicated by the green bars. And then we had a 9-species mixture containing 3 grasses, 3 legumes, and 3 herbs, indicated by the yellow bars. And all those mixtures were fertilized with 90 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. And these farmlets, or these farms, are stocked at a relatively high stocking rate of 12.5 ewes per hectare, and each ewe was rearing 2 lambs. And this work formed part of Connie Grace's PhD thesis. And the next few slides I'm going to present are all going to follow this same layout. The columns in the background are the data, and the box up the front, that basically represents the message I want to deliver based on each slide. So when we looked at the impact of these different sward types on the average daily gain of lambs from birth to 6 weeks of age, we saw that compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lambs suckling ewes which grazed the 6-species sward had an 18% higher growth rate to 6 weeks of age. And in sheep production systems, lamb performance up to 6 weeks of age is essentially a reflection of the milk production capacity of the ewe. So the ewes grazing the multi-species swards had a higher either volume or quality of milk produced to support the growth rate of their lambs. And when we move on to look at the impacts in that same study of lamb performance up till weaning, we can see that compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lambs suckling ewes, which graze the 6-species sward, had a 2.4 kilo higher live weight at weaning. And to put some further context on these results, the orange line across the middle of the slide here, that represents our target weaning weight for twin-bearing lambs at 30 weeks of age. So all our treatments outperformed our target. And perhaps most interestingly of all in this particular metric, anytime we made the sward more complex than simply perennial ryegrass, we did see an animal performance boost in terms of increased weaning weight at 14 weeks of age. Unsurprisingly then, these animals which had the higher weaning weight, they reached slaughter at an earlier age. So compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lambs fed any mixed sward reached slaughter approximately 2 weeks earlier. And this can have important knock-on effects on any farm. On a sheep farm, it'll free up herbage for the ewe coming into the mating period. And if we look back to some of the earlier work done with beef cattle, reducing the age at slaughter has positive impacts in terms of the carbon footprint per kilo of meat produced. So there's potentially a second win here, which we're currently modeling at the moment. And it's important, again, to realize that these animal performance benefits, they were achieved from systems which are fertilized with 45% less fertilizer nitrogen. And essentially, compared to perennial ryegrass swards, multi-species swards produce the same quantity of herbage with 45% less fertilizer nitrogen application. So the animal performance benefits weren't being achieved as a result of concentrate supplementation or some other type of supplement being brought into the system. So they're really interesting results in terms of animal performance. I think that for me, the next set of slides I'm going to present are perhaps the most important from that sheep study. And it looks at the effect of sward type on the requirement for antihelminthic treatments in our sheep production systems. And it's perhaps one of the greatest challenges facing pasture-based sheep production systems is the developing resistance that antihelminthic drugs are the drugs we use to control roundworms and stomach worms in our sheep. So with our multi-species swards, the interval from one dosing to the next was longer for lambs grazing multi-species swards. So essentially what we were doing in this study, we were measuring the fecal egg count as the crude indication of parasite burden of our animals every 2 weeks. And when they hit a threshold, they were drenched on a treatment basis. So what we saw with our perennial ryegrass animals is that they were being dosed every 4 to 5 weeks. That was extended by a week up to about 6 weeks for the animals grazing the multi-species or grazing the ryegrass white clover sward, and then up to 7 to 8 weeks for the animals grazing the multi-species swards. And that meant over the lifetime of those animals that the animals grazing the multi-species swards required about 50% fewer drench administrations compared to the animals grazing the perennial ryegrass only sward. So despite my bias, for sheep, the real, I suppose, potential for these swards at a national level are in our cattle systems, and Helen has already described the Smart Sward program we're involved in, which is focused on beef cattle. We've just completed, or in 2020 was the first full year of grazing on that platform, and Helen has described the different treatments, our ryegrass white clover, and our multi-species swards. So these data are at an early stage of analysis. But Fionnuala Godwin, who's the PhD student running this program, she has some data available looking at the impact of sward type on the average daily gain of Hereford steers from the dairy herd during their second year at pasture. And compared to animals grazing perennial ryegrass only swards, animals which grazed either a multi-species sward or the perennial ryegrass white clover sward had a 20% higher growth rate during their second year of grass. And which ultimately resulted in the animals grazing those swards being slaughtered at a younger age. And again, that data is currently being analysed by Fionnuala. Then to move on into the work with our colleagues in Devonish as part of the Marie Curie funded Heartland project. And in this study, we had 4 sward treatments, and these were grazed by cattle and sheep together. So they were grazed by heifers from beef heifers and by ewes and lambs in a co-grazing scenario. And again, I suppose really promisingly from our perspective, the data or results we produced at Lyons were mirrored or reflected in the data we've produced in Doubt to date. Granted, it's only 1 year of data, but Gaspar Bocarne is the PhD student working there, and his work would show that lambs grazing multi-species swards had a 24% higher average daily gain than animals grazing either a perennial ryegrass pasture or an old permanent pasture from turnout to slaughter. And the net result of that was that in this particular study, the animals grazing the multi-species swards were slaughtered approximately a month earlier on average than their counterparts grazing the perennial ryegrass and the old permanent pasture swards. Then to look at the performance of the heifers involved in that co-grazing study, again, we're seeing a positive benefit in terms of animal performance from the animals grazing the 6 species multi-species sward. And beef heifers grazing the 6 species mix had a 13% higher average daily gain than animals grazing the perennial ryegrass and the permanent pasture during their second summer grass. And this is something we've seen now in a number of studies, that the 6 species mixture seems to be the best performing mixture of the mixtures we have tested. And at least in the limited range of studies we have conducted, increasing the number of species to a 9 or a 12 species mixture hasn't impacted on animal performance over and above what we're achieving at the 6 species mixture level. And the final piece of work I want to speak about is some work being conducted by Kate McCarthy in Lyons. Kate is another one of our PhD students working on the SmartSward project. And Kate has conducted a zero grazing study with dairy cows in 2020, and it was zero graze for logistical reasons rather than we necessarily wanted to test the swards under a zero grazing scenario. And again, we had our perennial ryegrass monoculture at a high level of fertilizer nitrogen, our ryegrass white clover at 90 kilos, and our multi-species sward at 90 kilos. And to finish up, I'm just going to present 3 slides of results from this piece of work. Firstly, we looked at sward dry matter intake, or forage dry matter intake, and the mid-lactation. This was offered to mid-lactation dairy cows in UCD Lyons Farm. The animals grazing either the perennial ryegrass white clover or the multi-species sward had a higher forage dry matter intake compared to the animals grazing the perennial ryegrass only sward. When we look then at the effect of these swards on milk yield, the animals grazing the multi-species sward had a higher energy corrected milk yield compared to animals grazing either the perennial ryegrass sward or the perennial ryegrass and white clover sward. And then when we looked at the mixology yield, or the kilograms of fat and protein produced per cow per day, again, we were seeing that the mid-lactation dairy cows offered zero grazed forage had higher fat and protein yields when they were offered a multi-species sward. So we've seen consistent animal performance benefits from grazing these multi-species swards over the duration of the studies which we have conducted. So I think just to sum up, and Helen has laid it out very well at the beginning of her presentation, Irish and global agriculture is faced with several challenges. And offering animal swards consisting of more than a single species improves animal performance. I'm quite confident to say that now. I think what we need to do before we have wider rollout of multi-species swards is to come up with the systems that allow us to establish, manage, and ensure the persistence under grazing of these multi-species swards. And you know, there is a body of work to be conducted in that. We need to measure the direct environmental impacts of these swards under Irish conditions, but certainly a lot of the early indications and a lot of the logical thinking would suggest that there should be environmental benefits as well from an emissions perspective. And Helen has already listed some of the benefits from an invertebrate earthworm population perspective. And I think it's also important to say that multi-species swards, they're not a silver bullet solution, but I believe they will form part of an array of solutions available to farmers into the future. So I'll finish up there, Mark, and if there's any questions, we'll try to deal with them.
Thanks very much, Tommy. That was excellent and really complemented John Finn's presentation from a number of weeks ago. So thank you for that. And Helen, we invite you to join us again, and if you can do so. We have lots and lots of questions coming through here. So generated a lot of interest, and the same also with John's presentation a few weeks ago. I suppose a few questions coming through there around the whole persistence of these swards, and the level of work that's involved in maintaining them compared to your traditional perennial ryegrass sward. Helen, you were talking about, you mentioned persistence in your presentation. I mean, what have your findings been on that?
Yeah, Mark, I showed some of the, I suppose, the graphs of persistence of some of the species there within the presentation. I suppose what we do know about persistence is that they're not going to persist particularly well, certainly if they're managed as a ryegrass sward. That's not the management that is going to benefit these swards and help them to continue into the future. So we've got to tailor that management. And I guess what we're trying to do within our current projects with our collaborators is to learn what management is required to enhance persistence. So some of the things we're looking at are, varying the post-grazing sward height from your kind of traditional approach of 4 centimeters with a ryegrass sward, for example, up to 6 centimeters to try and benefit the herb component within the multi-species sward. Also increasing the duration of the length of the rotation in them to allow the herbs to recover between the various rotations, So we're learning that process. We're collecting data on it to see how the different species respond in response to changing these variables. But I guess when we put all that together, we hope that we'll have some more definitive answers on how best to manage them for persistence.
Thanks, Helen. Tommy, if I could turn to you, the last time we were talking to John Finn, he was encouraging farmers to maybe experiment with this. That whilst the research is still ongoing, that there is a lot of conclusive outcomes from the research, and that it is ready for trialing in a real environment. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think, Mark, as I said, when we get these swards established and we have multi-species swards available to our animals and the animals graze them, their performance is improved, and that's clear across dairy, beef and sheep co-grazing systems and sheep-only systems now at this stage. And I think if farmers are looking at putting in these into their farms, into their system, it does need a little bit of thought and a little bit of consideration. And I wouldn't be a huge fan of just throwing in a paddock into the general rotation and the cows hit that once every 21 days, or the cattle come into it once every couple of months. I think and there's various reasons for that, because they're not going to be managed optimally in that scenario, because you'd be in the ryegrass management mindset and you're going to chuck your cows into your multi-species sward and graze it as ryegrass, and we know it won't persist under that scenario. What I would like to see is setting up enough of the land area that you can have a rotation running through your multi-species sward. So if that's 10-15% of the land area is dedicated to them, and for example on a dairy farm, you might put your replacement calves into that and rotate them around through it for the year, where the animals can adapt to the multi-species sward and that they're not coming in and coming out of it, so that there's a priority stock class given access to that. The fear I would have, or the concern that maybe if we just say, okay, throw them in and they don't get the optimum management and they fail, it's a failure of the sward rather than some other problem in the management of the sward. Certainly get them out on the farm, but not just give it some consideration how they're introduced into the rotations.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really good advice, and that you can understand that, one grazing in 21 or 21 days is probably more of a shock to the system, all right, than actual gradually introducing or maintaining it with the diet. Pat, some really good questions coming in, building on that last presentation. We thought we had exhausted all the questions with John Finn, but huge interest.
Yeah, I think a huge interest across a range of topics. One that's come through is the performance in the early season. And Helen, you had a graph there. I think it was just of one case where I think it showed that the 12 species was performing in that early season the same as perennial ryegrass, but there might have been a little bit of a dip in the 6 species. Just, I suppose, the question is, what is the level of performance that you've seen in that, I suppose, critical early season period?
Well, just to go back to that, I guess it's going to come down very much to soil temperature is going to have a critical impact on that, and getting the legumes to do their work within that time period. Certainly, I'm just bringing up. So in spring, the work that we had done had shown that we were getting about 3 tons of dry matter coming from the perennial ryegrass at the 250 kgN, but we were getting between 3.5 and 4 tons on some of our other mixes.
So it doesn't seem to be a problem there.
As I say, soil temperature will have an impact there in terms of the legume performance, making sure that they can drive the system, because you're depending very much on them. But we're front loading our nitrogen applications onto those swards as well, so getting it out early.
A couple of questions in relation to potential reseeding and the prospect of not having to plough in terms of maintaining carbon in the soil. How does that work relative, say, to perennial ryegrass?
Okay, so it's certainly something we're very conscious of, and we want to know more about. So at plot level with our partners in Devonish, we're looking at a conventional kind of plough till sow versus direct drill of seed into the sward. And I think I can say at this stage that there doesn't appear to be a difference in terms of establishment and subsequent performance from the very early data we have from that.
Okay. Question then, in relation to baseline soil fertility, are you seeing a kind of a high requirement to get your soil fertility right, or does it, if you have mixed soil fertilities on the farm, are you going to get persistence?
I guess what we see is, if it's more about the soil health overall, I think, and pH included within that. And certainly, if you've got poor soil fertility, background fertility, that would, on which poor soil health, I suppose, in the background, where a ryegrass monoculture won't grow well, then your multi-species mix won't necessarily perform fantastically either. So we need to get broader soil health sorted out in order for these to perform well. And also, of course, pH is hugely important with the legumes in that.
I think, Pat, if we could just jump in there as well. I think in any sward rejuvenation program, reseeding is nearly the last step on the stairs. You need to get your soil fertility right, your soil pH, your P&K indexes, your grazing infrastructure, your management systems in place first. If you put the cart before the horse with reseeding first of all and hoping all those other things will come afterwards, I think it can often be a poor use of resources. To go back to the direct drilling question, in the Smartcross project, and the results are presented of Connie Grace's PhD thesis, those swards were direct drilled in that particular study. Okay.
There's a question there in relation to, or two questions, one in relation to, I suppose, heavy soils, and as a specific piece on that in relation to potential for poaching. Is it increased or decreased? And then there's a question in relation to its relevance on peaty soils.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that we should be putting them in on peaty soils, but heavy soils, I guess we just, you have to be careful of them. You have to ensure that you're not going to damage them. But what I draw your attention to that earlier slide I showed on water infiltration rates as well, that we seem to be getting enhanced earthworm populations under these sward types, and also as a consequence of that, the enhanced infiltration rates within these. So in fact, the whole thing could actually assist in allowing a longer grazing period potentially over time, you know, once you get a few years of those sward types in on those kind of soils.
Yeah, and that addresses another question that was there in relation to infiltration and the possibility that it might help reduce overland flow if you get better drainage. I think you've kind of answered that, have you?
I don't think it'll happen overnight, Pat.
Yeah.
You know, it's going to take a while for that to build up, but I think there's potential there.
Yeah, and another question in relation to water quality relates to, I suppose, the N leaching and the possibility for, I suppose, particularly autumn, high levels of N arising from plover in particular in the autumn. Is that a concern, or is it more than counteracted by, I suppose, the general reduction in nitrogen levels, or is there any work going on in that space?
I suppose the honest answer to that question, we don't know at this stage, but we are collecting the data on that Smart Sward platform that Helen has outlined. We do have the capacity to measure the nutrient loss in the water, and our colleague Paul Murphy is very much centrally involved in that program. But yeah, with legume rich swards, you do have that risk in the autumn and over winter of the breakdown of the legume and the release of nitrogen in the system.
We have a few questions coming in relation to the ensilability of these swards, and you know, how successful has that been, and is there additional wilting required or additional management around silage cutting time?
Maybe I'll jump in there.
First, Helen.
So based on Thomas Maloney's work with range, certainly would have found that you can make as good a quality silage from the multi-species as a good ryegrass silage. However, only if weather conditions are good, and if there's enough wilting going on. And certainly would reflect our own experience, I think, out on the platform as well. So if you've got poor weather conditions, you're going to make a much worse silage than a bad ryegrass silage when you go with these. So you have to have a good wilt.
I think you probably have a narrower window in the year mark where you can actually successfully make silage if you have a lot of chicory and plantain in your sward in particular. We've made good and bad silage, I suppose, on the platform. The good silage, when our first cut in 2020 across the system was good quality silage, and the animals performed about 200 grams per day extra in their first winter indoors on the multi-species silage compared to the perennial ryegrass silage. We do have another piece of work of another PhD student, Jonathan Higgins, who's looking at a multi-species swards, but with a specific silage mixture in that system. So the animals have multi-species grazing for the majority of the year, and the silage swards are a ryegrass red clover mix. So there are ways around that challenge as well.
There's a question here in relation to its potential in organic farming relative to, I suppose, traditional mixes with zero nitrogen effectively.
Well, I guess a number of the slides that I showed there earlier on did show that a lot of our mixes that we had trialed during Smartcross were performing well, even under zero N conditions. So I guess it's down to individuals then to decide, you know, if they want to farm in that way, and that's you know, that these mixes can perform well under those conditions, but how far you want to push them then is a decision that each individual has to take.
A lot of the discussion so far is about reduced nitrogen, but has there been any work being done on the indices of phosphorus required to grow these species, or is there any difference at all between that and traditional ryegrass swards?
It's not something we've investigated yet, Mark, and we've kept P and K non-limiting in all our studies to date. I think, you know, particularly at the reseeding stage, phosphorus is so important for seedling germination that it'd be hard to construct an argument immediately to use that. But again, it's another one of these questions that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. How are we doing there, Pat?
Yeah, I suppose there's a number of questions in relation to habitats and biodiversity, whether there's an improvement in biodiversity outcomes as a result of multi-species. I suppose that's to you, Helen, that's your area of expertise.
Okay, so I put up some of the results we had generated from the earthworm studies, but we did actually measure other components of invertebrate biodiversity within the Smartcross project. And certainly there seemed to be a positive response in terms of overall invertebrate abundance, but also abundance and diversity of beetles, and also abundance of parasitic Hymenoptera. Now, we haven't gone, there could be responses elsewhere, but those were the ones that we've looked at to date. But we do hope to expand on that work in future projects, so that we can, you know, get a better grasp. I mean, there's certainly never going to be a replacement for your permanent semi-natural grassland and in terms of the biodiversity they can support. But what the data so far seems to be telling us is that they enhance the invertebrate diversity in comparison to a ryegrass monoculture.
Okay. There's a question there relating to, is there a complete stop of nitrogen applications during the summer period, or at what time do you actually cut the nitrogen out of the system?
Yeah, so we were front loading our nitrogen input into those systems, so trying to stop it, I guess, when legumes really kick in. So I guess our cutoff period would generally be around the early May. We've been trying to completely stop it from there on.
Okay. Question in relation to animal health. Has there been any issues with bloat or any other negative effects on animal health?
Not in our beef or our sheep grazing studies to date, Pat. We've seen any indices of animal health we've measured. It's been positive. There were some bloat issues on the zero grazing trial with the dairy cows, but that was across the ryegrass and the ryegrass white clover and the multi-species swards, just the same. Obviously, with any, particularly in a dairy scenario where your cows have been turned out to the paddock after coming out of the milking parlour, in any situation where you have high levels of legume in a sward, you do need to be conscious of your management to minimise the risk of bloat. So maybe putting up an initial fire to restrict their area for an hour or two after turnout, or bloat oil in the water or something like that. But we haven't experienced any problems per se in our grazing scenarios to date.
We're coming towards the end. I suppose a nice simple question for you. Is this the future of grassland farming? Well,
I'll jump in first there maybe, and Helen can come in afterwards. I think we've seen really positive results, part of the benefits of multi-species swards today, but we need to be conscious of the potential for impact and infiltration at industry level. You know, a very small percentage of our grassland is reseeded every year. Probably a lot of that grassland is in a reseeding cycle. So it's the same grassland being reseeded time and time again over the course of 10, 20 years. And those seed sales are dominated by perennial ryegrass seed at the moment, accounting for 95% plus of our seed sales. So is it the future of grassland? I don't think it's going to be a light switch moment, but I do think it's going to be, you know, one of a range of options that are available to farmers. And, you know, the animal performance benefits from my perspective are clear, and overcoming some of the persistency and establishment challenges will make it a more attractive tool at farm level.
Well, it's just to agree with all of what Tommy has said, and just to say that I think they're really only, you know, suitable for sowing into swards in areas where you would be sowing in ryegrass anyhow. These are not kind of I personally would not like to see permanent grasslands being ploughed up to put these in, you know. I think it's in areas where you're going to be doing the reseeding anyhow, and where you have already modified the grassland to such a degree, I think are the only areas where these should really be considered.
A question there in relation to, I suppose we have a number of zero grazing systems, and farmers particularly who have issues with dispersed land. A lot of your trials has been done on a kind of a cut basis. They're the early trials. Do you see a potential role for this for farmers who have zero grazing systems?
Yeah, potentially I could see it working there, Pat. And you know, the data from Helen's work in Smartcross showed that they do persist better under cutting regimes compared to grazing regimes. And then it's all about what species farmers want to include in their mix to I suppose optimize their animal performance thereafter.
Okay, we have come to the end of our slot here today. Tommy and Helen, thank you so much for your presentations, and your presentations will be available on the Teagasc website afterwards, and a recording of today's webinar. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production team, Andy Boland and Yvonne Maher and Pat Murphy, and to thank the audience for sticking with us throughout the year. It's been a strange year for everybody, but we do hope that this series has, I suppose, given people some level of an anchor throughout this strange time. Before we leave you, I just want to share some details with you of an event that's taking place next week. It's being organised by the Climate Change Commission in New Zealand, and they've got in touch with us just to ask us to maybe to let you know about this event. It's a webinar taking place next Thursday at 8 a.m. Irish time, so it's evening time over New Zealand, and it's with Professor Frank Convery from the UCD Earth Institute, and they'll be talking about low emissions future and the similarities between Ireland and New Zealand on leading the climate way towards climate action. So I do encourage you to check that out. If you just Google Climate Change Commission, the details will be available there. So to say thank you again, Tommy and Helen and Pat, for helping with questions today. And we'll be back next week at the normal time on Friday at 9:30. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Okay, we'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.